What are the indications for closure? Irrespective of the fact whether the patient has symptoms or not, we would always close ESDs as soon as we see that there is a hemodynamically significant shunt, and this means that there is a sign of right ventricular volume overload. There's the only difficult question in the patients with severe pulmonary hypertension, and in most centers we have the experience that as soon as we get up to a pulmonary vascular resistance of 5 Wood units, it's unlikely that this patient will benefit from ESD closure, at least not for complete closure. These patients may be evaluated for a fenestrated closure, but in general do not benefit from complete closure. But all the other patients, as I've said, this is very rare that we have such severe pulmonary vascular resistance elevation. In all the other patients, atrial septal defect closure is indicated as soon as the shunt is hemodynamically relevant. Before we decide how we can close this defect, whether it's possible by catheter intervention or only surgically, we need to answer the following questions. Of course, the first question is the location and the type of the ESD, because it's only the secundum ASD that can be approached by catheter intervention. Of course, additional anomalies such as abnormal pulmonary venous drainage have to be excluded because they can also not be dealt with by catheter intervention. The next critical question is the size of the defect. In general, all the defects with a native diameter of less than 20 millimeters are ideal for closure. Those with diameters of 20 to 25 millimeters, it's uncertain from this pre-evaluation, and we have to wait for a balloon stretched diameter measurement. In general, all the patients with a native diameter larger than 25 millimeters have a defect too large to be closed by catheter intervention. It's not really possible to predict the balloon stretch diameter from the native diameter, even when we take into account the thickness of the septum and other criteria like aneurysm, etc. At least in our population, we did not find an algorithm that allowed us to predict the stretch diameter from the native diameter. And that's why we have this gray zone of 20 to 25 millimeters where it's rather uncertain whether this patient is still suitable for catheter intervention. Now, this is a TE example of a patient with a very large defect of several centimeters, almost 4 centimeters in this example here, certainly too large to be closed by catheter intervention. Another important question to answer is this a single defect, or as we see it in this case of 2 rather small defects, that there are 2 defects or even more than 2 defects? If these defects are very close to each other, it may be possible to close them with one device. When there is a distance of 50 millimeters or more, this is in general not possible by stretching and using a larger device, and we may have to consider to use more than one devices. Another important information is the presence and extent of an aneurysm of the interatrial septum. If you have very large aneurysms, very mobile aneurysms, it may be difficult to get a stable position for the occluder, so this also has to be carefully evaluated before closure. The distance rim to surrounding structures is another critical value to be estimated. Particularly to the atrial wall, we need a rim of at least 5 millimeters or more. We need distance to the pulmonary veins and the AV valves. In the adult population, this is normally not the limitation, the proximity to pulmonary veins or AV valves, but a smaller than 5 millimeter rim, as we see it in this example, to the free atrial wall can indeed be a reason why we cannot close the defect. It's not necessary to have a rim of 5 millimeters to the aorta, and these patients don't have to be excluded for the procedure. Here we see examples of the occluders used currently for ASD closure, and it's in the majority of cases it's the Amplatzer occluser that's used, because the Amplatzer occluser is at least for the large defects is currently the best occluder. The other defects, the other occluders like the Starflex occluder or Helix occluder can only be used for smaller A12 defects. So the Amplatzer occluder is the rather universally usable device. And we see in these graphs here how the closure is performed. Coming from the IVC, the ASD is crossed here, and this is already shown as we would see it by TE monitoring, that we can really appreciate by TE whether we cross the defect. If there are more than one defects, we may be sure which defect we are crossing here with the wire. Then a catheter is put into the left atrium, and within this catheter we then insert the occluder, and as soon as we enter the right atrium and we leave the catheter, the shape again will be formed for the left atrial disc as shown here. We pull back the device into the defect and then release the right atrial disc, and should end up with a result like shown here, that the occluder holds itself on the atrial septal defect, and as soon as we are sure that we have a stable position, that there's no residual shunt, the occluder is released, and we would hopefully end up with this nice result shown in this last graph here. This is an example showing the already deployed occluder, the left atrial disc and the right atrial disc, and this is nicely sitting here on the left, on the interatrial septum, and the waist nicely closes the atrial septal defect in this patient here. These are examples of transthoracic echoes of Amplatzer occluders after closure, here in a subcostal view and in the four-chamber view. And what we will look for during the follow-up, we'll look for residual ASDs. We will look for thrombus formation, which is fortunately very rare but can sometimes occur. Of course, we will monitor the regression of RV size, the regression of pulmonary artery pressure, and any changes in tricuspid regurgitation after closing the defect. When we monitor the procedure, for some of the complications, TE is very important. We see here an example of misplacement of the occluder with residual left to right shunt. As soon as we see this, we can again pull back the occluder and start again with employing the left atrial and right atrial disc. So TE is very important for a safe procedure. Nowadays, the closure of an ASD by catheter intervention can be performed with a very low complication rate. We may have some arrhythmias, which are normally transient and no problem. There are some puncture-related complications, such as bleeding. Embolization of the device should be very, very unusual, and SD elevation can be due to air embolism, but again, this can be easily avoided by some experience. This again shows in a loop a patient with a situation where we can expect malposition. It's only the left atrial disc that's already employed, but we see here the aorta, and we see that this disc is already at least partially in the right atrium. So when we deploy in this position the right atrial disc, we can be sure that we have misplacement and we have residual shunt here at the aortic site.